Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing the concept of trauma, what it is, how it affects individuals, and why understanding trauma is important in psychology, literature, and everyday life. Before Cathy Caruth, most psychological studies treated trauma simply as a mental illness, a localized injury to the brain, or a collection of symptoms to be diagnosed and treated by a doctor. Caruth radically shifted this perspective. She brought trauma into the worlds of literature, history, and narrative philosophy, transforming how we understand the relationship between catastrophic events and human consciousness. Caruth asks a fundamentally disorienting question. What does it mean for an event to be so shocking that it is completely missed when it occurs? How does an experience become unclaimed, and how does that unexperienced event return to haunt not just single individuals but entire cultures and historical epochs? The primary theoretical contribution of Caruth is the definition of trauma not as a physical scar or a simple memory of a bad event, but as an epistemological crisis, a breakdown of human knowledge and comprehension itself. Trauma is defined by a deep inner paradox. When a person is caught in a catastrophic event, a horrific train crash, a battlefield explosion, or a sudden act of extreme violence, the mind is completely overwhelmed. Because the shock is so sudden and intense, the cognitive faculties fail to process it in real time. The victim does not fully experience the event as it happens. The event is registered by the senses, but it cannot be placed into the mind's normal narrative filing system. It remains unassimilated, ununderstood, and unclaimed. The experience falls into a void, never transformed into the kind of memory we can consciously access and narrate. This is the crucial insight. Trauma is not the memory of an event, it is the inherent gap where an experience should have been. The reality of the event is defined precisely by the fact that it was missed. The victim is haunted not by something they remember too well, but by an event that they could not fully possess through consciousness in the first place. Consider a soldier in combat. The explosion occurs, his body registers the shock, his ears hear the blast, his eyes see the destruction, but his conscious mind cannot integrate these sensations into a coherent narrative because the event exceeds his capacity for comprehension. Later, when he suffers flashbacks, he is not remembering something he once knew, he is encountering for the first time something he never fully knew it at all. The paradox is that the most overwhelming events are often the ones we least experience. If an event is completely missed when it happens, how does it become known to us? This brings us to Caruth's second major theoretical pillar, latency. Latency describes the strange, quiet interval of time that exists between the occurrence of a catastrophic event and its sudden disruptive arrival in a person's consciousness. Trauma does not strike immediately, it requires a period of delay. This delay is not a failure of the mind, it is the very structure of traumatic experience. Consider Freud's classic example. A person involved in a terrible train accident walks away seemingly uninjured. They go home, sleep, and feel perfectly normal for days or weeks. Then, suddenly, weeks later, they wake up screaming in the middle of the night, paralyzed by terrifying literal flashbacks of the crash. What happened during the quiet latent period? Caruth explains that during latency, the unprocessed raw sensory data of the accident sat outside conscious awareness. Because it was never turned into a standard memory, it returns later with a brutal, aggressive literalness. The flashbacks are not creative interpretations of the past, they are the exact uncoded event breaking into the present. There is no distance, no perspective, no this reminds me of, only the raw event happening again. The truth of trauma is always belated. It is an experience that can only be known through its repetition, arriving like a ghost that refuses to stay buried in the past. This belatedness is not a defect to be cured, but a feature to be understood. We do not know what happened to us until it happens again, differently in the form of a nightmare or an intrusive image. The event is known only in its return. Caruth uses a classic literary story to illustrate the relationship between injury and storytelling. The story of Tancred and Clorinda from Torquato Tasso's epic poem Jerusalem Delivered. The hero Tancred accidentally fights and kills his beloved Clorinda while she is disguised in the armor of an enemy knight. He buries her, heartbroken. Later, Tancred walks into a magical haunted forest and slashes his sword at a massive tree. To his horror, blood pours out of the tree trunk, and he hears the weeping voice of Clorinda's spirit crying out that he has wounded her yet again. Caruth transforms this tragic myth into a theoretical model for the language of trauma. Tancred's trauma is not just the memory of killing his lover, it is the fact that he was blind and unaware when he did it. The trauma is only revealed when he strikes the tree, and the wound itself takes on a voice to tell him what he did. The injury speaks. The truth emerges not from Tancred's conscious recollection, but from the voice of the wounded other. Caruth argues that literature, poetry, and narrative act exactly like Clorinda's crying tree. When survivors of trauma write testimonies, poetry, or stories, they are not just recounting facts. Their language is a direct expression of a wound that is trying to speak a truth that the conscious mind still does not fully comprehend. The narrative is an enactment of an inner injury, crying out to be heard by someone else. This is why traumatic narratives often seem fragmented, repetitive, or confused. They are not failed stories, they are accurate expressions of a wound that has not yet healed into linear memory. The gaps, the stutters, the sudden returns, these are not errors in communication, but the very shape of traumatic truth trying to find a witness. Caruth does not restrict her theory to individual psychology. She scales her insights up to the level of collective history. She redefines history itself as a crisis of witnessing. Traditional historians treat history as a solid linear line of clear facts, documents, and conscious actions. Caruth shatters this assumption. Massive historical events, the Holocaust, slavery, atomic warfare, the Vietnam War, are so profoundly catastrophic that they overwhelm the collective consciousness of entire generations. Because these events are collectively missed or incomprehensible as they occur, history cannot be understood as a straightforward narrative of progress. Instead, history is driven by the erratic, recurring, and latent returns of collective trauma. Nations do not simply move forward from their catastrophes, they circle around them, returning again and again to wounds they cannot fully comprehend. The 20th century is not a century of solutions, but a century of belated returns to unassimilated horrors. She introduces a highly original concept, the interconnectedness of trauma. Different cultures and nations are not isolated from one another, they are bound together precisely by the fact that their traumas are entangled. When one culture's catastrophic wound speaks, it often addresses or triggers the unhealed wound of another culture. History is a vast, invisible web of shared, unclaimed experiences where different peoples are forced to listen to each other's crying wounds in order to survive together. This insight has profound implications for how we understand political conflict, cultural memory, and the possibility of reconciliation across historical divides. To ground her theories in structural psychology, Caruth dedicates significant space to a radical rereading of two of Freud's most difficult texts, Beyond the Pleasure Principle and Moses and Monotheism. Freud was puzzled by World War I soldiers who kept dreaming of their terrifying trench war experiences. According to Freud's older theories, the mind always seeks pleasure and avoids pain. So, why would the mind force a person to relive an absolute nightmare every single night? Freud's discovery of the death drive and repetition compulsion was actually a discovery about the nature of survival. The soldier reproduces the nightmare not to cause pain, but because the mind is trying to retroactively prepare for a shock it missed. The nightmare is an attempt to master an unmastered past. Caruth turns Freud upside down. Trauma is not a symptom of a wish to die. It is a terrifying reality of having survived an event without knowing how. Survival itself becomes a source of horror because the survivor carries an event they cannot fully claim as their own experience. The question is not, why do I want to die, but how did I survive and what does that survival mean? In his book Moses and Monotheism, Freud claims that Moses was actually an Egyptian prince who was murdered by his own people in the desert, and Jewish religion was born centuries later out of the repressed guilt of that forgotten murder. Caruth ignores the literal historical accuracy of Freud's claim and focuses entirely on its theoretical genius. Freud invented a model for collective cultural trauma. The murder of Moses was missed by the people. It was repressed during a long latent period in the desert. Only generations later did the memory return in the form of a strict, powerful monotheistic religion. Caruth uses this to prove that entire cultures, traditions, and political identities are built not around glorious victories but around deep, forgotten, latent historical traumas that shape modern behavior from behind the scenes. What a nation forgets or cannot fully experience may be more determinative of its identity than what it proudly remembers. If trauma is an unexperienced gap and its language is an enigmatic cry from a wound, how should we respond? Caruth warns against the danger of trying to heal or clean up trauma too quickly. Traditional therapy or history often tries to force a survivor to translate their trauma into a neat, simple, comfortable story. We want them to say, "This happened to me, it is over now, and I am fine." This approach is an act of intellectual violence that silences the true nature of the wound. If you translate trauma into a standard, comfortable narrative, you erase the very gap that defines its truth. You replace the survivor's actual experience with a story that makes you feel better. Instead, Caruth calls for a new ethics of deep listening. To listen to a witness of trauma requires us to abandon our need for simple answers and easy closures. We must learn to listen to the gaps, silences, and stuttering repetitions and the confusion. When we listen to the literal return of an unclaimed experience, we are participating in a profound act of empathy. We allow our cognitive certainties to be disrupted by the voice of the wounded other. This ethical stance has profound implications for clinical practice, for historical writing, and for how we read literature. It asks us to tolerate discomfort, to resist the urge to explain away what disturbs us, and to remain present with what cannot be easily assimilated. Let us conclude what we discussed today. First, trauma is a missed experience. It is not a memory of a past. It is a profound cognitive failure to fully experience a catastrophe as it occurs. The victim is haunted not by what they remember, but by what they could not assimilate. Second, truth arrives through latency. Trauma is defined by delay. It stays hidden outside conscious memory until it bursts into the present through literal intrusive repetitions like flashbacks, nightmares, and unbidden images. Third, literature is a crying wound. Like the myth of Tancred and Clorinda, Narrative language acts as a medium through which an inner injury speaks a truth that cannot be articulated by ordinary literal speech. Fragmented testimonies are not failed narratives but faithful expressions of unclaimed experience. Fourth, history is interconnected. Collective traumas shape the destinies of nations. History is an ongoing crisis of witnessing, and our survival depends on our ethical capacity to listen to the entangled wounds of others without forcing them into comfortable stories. Thank you.